February 17th, 1500. A fierce winter storm hammers the marshlands of northern Europe. On a narrow dike road in the flat wetlands of Dithmarschen, a mighty army of Danish knights and mercenaries presses forward, their banners whipping in the icy wind. They have been promised an easy victory over peasant rebels, but instead they find themselves entering a nightmare. Suddenly, horns echo across the plain, and freezing seawater surges into the fields. What was solid ground moments ago turns to a vast expanse of muddy swamp. Armoured knights on horseback reel in panic as the floodwaters rise around them. War horses scream and topple, flinging their riders into the cold, sucking mire. Men sink waist-deep in mud. The weight of their heavy plate armour drags them further down. An army that expected glory is now drowning in a bog, helpless. On the sidelines, hidden behind dikes and improvised ramparts, peasant militiamen watch this chaos unfold. Gripping their weapons tightly, they prepare to surge forward. How could an untrained peasant force bring a proud knightly army to such an end? The answer lies in the story of the Battle of Hemmingstedt, a battle where nature itself became the deadliest weapon. To understand how it came to this watery catastrophe, we must go back a few days and set the stage. Dithmarschen, in the late 15th century, was a remarkable anomaly in Europe, a peasants' republic tucked between the North Sea and the German lands of Holstein. For generations, the fiercely independent farmers, fishermen, and merchants of Dithmarschen had governed themselves and fended off attempts by powerful neighbours to subjugate them. Surrounded by feudal kingdoms and duchies, these peasants maintained a stubborn autonomy. Their land was marshy and flat, crisscrossed with canals and protected by man-made dikes that held back the sea. This landscape was difficult for outsiders to navigate, but the locals knew it intimately. By 1500, the Dithmarschen Republic had become a thorn in the side of the King of Denmark, who also ruled the neighbouring duchy of Schleswig-Holstein. The Danish crown had long claimed suzerainty over Dithmarschen, but in reality, the peasant republic acted independently and refused to pay taxes or bow to distant rulers. This defiance could not be tolerated forever. In 1499, King John of Denmark, also known as King Hans, along with his brother Frederick, the co-ruler of Schleswig and Holstein, decided the time had come to crush Dithmarschen once and for all. King John demanded that the Dithmarschen folk pay him tribute and allow royal forts on their soil. The proud peasant leaders flatly refused. Incensed and eager to assert his authority, King John mustered a formidable army to invade the region. He likely imagined a quick campaign, a show of force to humble a ragtag peasant militia. By the winter of 1500, his preparations were complete. An imposing host of roughly 12,000 men marched under the royal banner of Denmark and the Kalmar Union, heading south into Dithmarschen. This was no mere feudal levy. It was a professional fighting force assembled for a decisive conquest. King John's invasion army was one of the most powerful of its day. It included around 2,000 armoured knights and noblemen from Denmark and Germany, the heavy cavalry that formed the backbone of medieval armies. Alongside them were 4,000 German Landsknecht mercenaries, known as the Great Guard or Black Guard, led by a hardened mercenary captain, Junker Thomas Slentz. These Landsknechts were seasoned soldiers of fortune, decked out in flamboyant outfits, but equipped with deadly pikes, halberds, swords, and early firearms. Backing them up were 5,000 infantry conscripted from King John's Danish and Holstein domains, common foot soldiers, crossbowmen, and arquebusiers, as well as about 1,000 artillerymen, with dozens of cannons. A train of wagons carried the army's supplies, gunpowder, and the king's war chest, the money to pay the mercenaries. This was a well-equipped, well-financed force. By all accounts, it dwarfed anything the peasants of Dithmarschen could field. King John was so confident that some chronicles say he treated the campaign like a grand hunting expedition or a field trip into the countryside. The Danish nobles and knights were eager for glory and plunder, fully expecting a swift victory over the upstart farmers. The invasion began in February 1500. On February 11th, the royal army crossed into Dithmarschen territory. The weather had been cold, and initially the marshy ground was frozen firm, making the advance easier. The first target was Meldorf, one of Dithmarschen's principal towns. On February 14th, the Danish-led forces reached Meldorf. The town fell quickly. Its defences were no match for a royal army. The invaders sacked and burned Meldorf as a warning to the rest of the region. Buildings were torched, and any resisting inhabitants were put to the sword. Flush with this early success, King John regrouped his army and began moving northward, aiming for the heart of Dithmarschen, the town of Heide, which was effectively the capital and symbolic stronghold of the peasants. The plan was likely to capture Heide, break any organised resistance, and thus bring Dithmarschen under royal control. So far, everything was going according to the king's plan. The peasants were on the run, and their towns were falling easily. However, the people of Dithmarschen were far from defeated. As the Danish army marched deeper into their land, the peasants were mobilizing a defense. Wolf Isebrand, a respected farmer and veteran leader in his 50s, emerged as one of the key commanders of the Dithmarschen militia. Under his guidance, calls went out across the region for able-bodied men to take up arms. Despite the chaos and fear following Meldorf's fall, hundreds, then thousands, of common folk answered the call. Peasant militia units formed from each village, armed with whatever weapons were available. Many carried simple farming tools like pitchforks and scythes turned into polearms. Others had swords, axes, longbows, or crossbows. A few mercantile families and former soldiers in Dithmarschen owned arquebuses, early matchlock guns, or even small cannon, which they now brought to the fight. Estimates of the Dithmarschen force vary, but perhaps 3,000 to 6,000 peasant fighters in total were mustered to face the invaders, vastly outnumbered 2 to 1 at best, and certainly out-equipped. Yet these peasants had crucial advantages: home turf and a clever plan. They knew the flat marshes and dikes intimately, and would use that knowledge to even the odds. Wolf Isebrand and the Dithmarschen Council of Leaders devised an unconventional strategy. They recognized that they could not defeat the Danish army in a traditional open-field battle. The enemy's knights and Landsknecht pikemen would overwhelm them. Instead, the peasants aimed to bottleneck and trap the invaders using the terrain. The main road from Meldorf to Heide was basically a raised causeway built slightly above the surrounding fields to provide firm footing through the marsh. This causeway was the only practical route for heavy wagons and cavalry to travel between those towns. On either side of it lay flat pastureland and polders that were normally somewhat soggy but passable in dry weather. Crucially, those fields were protected by dikes and drainage canals that kept the seawater out and allowed farming. Isebrand's plan was bold. If they could delay the Danish army at a certain point, they would flood the fields and trap the enemy on the road. The chosen choke point was near the village of Hemmingstedt, south of Heide. There, the causeway road narrowed and curved between marshy meadows. The Dithmarschen defenders worked quickly to prepare this spot. They built a large earthwork barricade across the road, essentially a makeshift fortification of mud, timber, and whatever debris they could pile up. Behind this earthen rampart, they placed a handful of cannon and ranged weapons to cover the approach. They nicknamed this fortification the Girder, or Garnischanze in some accounts, and it would force the invaders to stop and fight instead of marching straight through. Meanwhile, teams of peasants were sent to the dikes and sluice gates that managed water in the area. At Isebrand's signal, they would open the sluices and perhaps even cut the dikes, allowing water from the North Sea, via the river channels, to pour into the low-lying fields around Hemmingstedt. This kind of tactical flooding was risky. It would ruin their own farmland, but the situation was desperate. By sacrificing some land to the sea, the Dithmarscheners aimed to create a vast swamp right as the enemy arrived. The trap was set. Now they had to lure King John's army into it. On February 17th, 1500, the Danish army departed Meldorf at dawn, heading north along the causeway toward Hemmingstedt and Heide beyond. Nature seemed to side with the defenders that day. The weather, which had been freezing earlier in the month, suddenly began to thaw. As the temperature rose, the ground grew softer. And then, as if on cue, a fierce storm blew in. By late morning, heavy snow and sleet pelted down, driven by an icy wind. Freezing rain drenched the soldiers, soaking powder charges and turning the roads slick. The timing could not have been worse for the king's forces, or better for the peasants waiting ahead. The low clouds and swirling snow reduced visibility, perhaps masking the telltale signs that the fields were flooding. Sloshing through puddles and mud, the invaders pushed on, unwary. Approaching Hemmingstedt, the Danish vanguard finally spotted the Dithmarschen militia arrayed before them. Across the road, the way was barred by the peasant earthwork, behind which a ragtag but determined force could be seen. Peasant flags and banners, many displaying the image of St. Mary, their patron saint, fluttered defiantly in the gale. King John's troops, who had expected little organised resistance, now realised a fight was coming. The column ground to a halt in front of the barricade. Thomas Slentz, the mercenary captain of the Black Guard, moved to the front with his landsknechts. These professional soldiers likely formed the first wave of the attack. As rain and sleet stung their faces, some of the Danish knights dismounted and joined the infantry, preparing to storm the obstacle on foot. The cannons from both sides boomed intermittently, but the downpour made early gunfire largely ineffective. Wet powder and drenched fuses caused misfires and weak blasts. There was a tense lull as the two sides sized each other up in the storm. Then, according to later tales, Junker Slentz called out a dramatic challenge. Perhaps in keeping with knightly tradition, despite being a mercenary, he adopted chivalric flair. Slentz demanded that the Dithmarscheners send forth their strongest warrior to face him in single combat. A duel, man to man, to settle the fate of the battle, or at least to boastfully intimidate the enemy. The peasant ranks did not oblige him. These were farmers fighting for survival, not knights bound by codes of honour, and they had no interest in fair single combat. Some of King John's noblemen might have bristled at what they saw as peasant cowardice for refusing the duel, but if so, they didn't have long to complain. With his challenge unanswered, Captain Slentz decided to attack. Vorwärts! The Black Guard landsknechts surged ahead, pikes levelled and swords drawn, aiming to overrun the barricade. A thunderous battle cry erupted from the peasant line in the local dialect. Waar die gar de burde komt. Beware, guard, the farmer is coming. The first clash was ferocious. Slentz's mercenaries charged up the narrow road, bottlenecked by the ditches and flooded fields on either side. The Dithmarschen defenders opened fire with their few cannons and arquebuses, sending plumes of smoke and grapeshot into the onrushing ranks. At such close range, the volley tore into the front of the Black Guard column, knocking down dozens of men, but nothing could fully stop their momentum. Hardened landsknechts clambered over their fallen and smashed into the earthwork with brute force. A vicious melee ensued at the barricade. The mercenaries thrust with long pikes and halberds, trying to force a gap, while peasants atop the mound thrust back with spears, flails and farming tools. Muskets and crossbows fired at point-blank range, and men screamed as blades met flesh. For a moment, it looked as if the weight of King John's army would break through. Hand-to-hand combat raged along the earthwork, with the superior armour and weapons of the invaders pitted against the desperation and local savvy of the defenders. Thomas Slentz himself was at the forefront, urging his men on and cutting down peasants with his sword. But the defenders knew this terrain. Many had fought in these conditions before in local feuds. They stood sure-footed on the muddy embankment, refusing to yield. Crucially, the narrow front meant that the Danes and mercenaries could not bring their full numbers to bear. Only a few could fight abreast on the causeway, and the rest were stuck waiting behind. As the melee dragged on, the storm intensified. Stinging hail began to fall, hammering men on both sides. Wind gusts blew sheets of rain into the faces of the attackers. The fields on either side of the road were now visibly filling with water. But amid the chaos, the invaders had little time to ponder that ominous sign. Suddenly, a shout went up from the peasants. Thomas Slentz was down. Accounts differ on how the blackguard captain met his end. One popular legend holds that a Dithmarschen warrior named Reimer von Hemmingstedt engaged Slentz in the fray and struck him down with a massive axe or sword, killing the mercenary leader in single combat. Later storytellers celebrated Reimer as a folk hero, though modern historians suspect he may be more myth than reality. Another possibility is that Slentz was simply overwhelmed by multiple opponents amid the crush of battle, or even hit by a lucky shot. Whatever the case, the loss of their commander sent a shock through the ranks of the Landsknechts. The once coordinated assault began to falter as the mercenaries at the front wavered. Sensing their moment, the peasants counterattacked. With a roar, Wolf Eisenbrand and his comrades surged over their barricade, pushing back the disorganized Landsknechts. The lightly equipped Dithmarschen fighters moved with agility, wielding axes, clubs, and short weapons ideal for close-quarter fighting in the mud. Many of the invaders at the front fell back, stumbling over bodies and slipping on the drenched ground. The Black Guard began to retreat in chaos, but retreat was almost impossible. The causeway behind them was packed tight with rank upon rank of Danish soldiers, knights, and wagons. Those in the rear had been pushing forward, eager to join what they expected to be an easy mop-up of peasant rebels. Now the front was coming back at them, panicked and leaderless. Confusion rippled through the column. Orders shouted in German, and Danish mingled with screams and the unceasing roar of the storm. Before the officers in the rear could figure out what was happening, the whole Danish army's formation began to buckle. Then came the final stroke of the Dithmarschen plan. With the peasant counterattack gaining momentum, the flooding of the fields had reached its peak. Eisenbrand's earlier command to open the sluices had allowed the sea and rainwater to inundate the flat pastures around the road. What had been mere muddy ground in the morning was by early afternoon a series of shallow lakes and waterlogged bogs flanking the causeway. Some of the Danish soldiers, especially on the flanks of the column, now attempted to escape the crush on the road by moving off into the fields. Perhaps they thought they could maneuver around the barricade or find solid ground for a flank attack. Instead, they walked straight into a death trap. The fields that looked like solid earth were now treacherous pools of mud, concealed under a layer of icy water. Men stepped off the road and immediately sank to their knees, or deeper. Horses stumbled and floundered, throwing their armoured riders. Within minutes, hundreds of invaders were flailing in the flooded marshland, trying desperately to pull themselves out. The more they fought the mud, the more it seemed to grip them. Heavy breastplates, helmets, shields, and weapons became liabilities, weighing soldiers down as they struggled in the quagmire. The freezing water numbed limbs and sapped strength. What had been an organized battle line dissolved into utter mayhem. At this point, panic truly set in among King John's troops. The soldiers in the rear, who hadn't even fired a shot yet, saw the front ranks collapsing and heard the screams of drowning men. A ripple of fear turned into a rout. Knights and footmen alike began to flee back down the road, away from the killing zone. But retreat only compounded the disaster. The narrow dike they had marched in on was now slick with mud and jammed with terrified men running for their lives. Many of the proud knights, who had boasted of easy victory, were now trampling each other in a blind dash to escape. And the peasants of Dithmarschen were not about to let their oppressors slip away unharmed. With the enemy in disarray, the peasant militia pressed the attack. They chased the fleeing soldiers along the causeway and even into the flooded fields. In those marshes, the lightly clad locals had the advantage. They knew where the ditches and deeper bogs were, and many carried long wooden poles, which they used like vaulting sticks to vault over water channels, a traditional skill in that region. They could traverse the muck far more nimbly than armoured outsiders. One by one, groups of Danish soldiers found themselves isolated, stuck in mud, or cut off by channels, and the peasants descended upon them. What followed was less a battle and more a slaughter. Struggling invaders were cut down with farming flails and axes, or shot at close range. Others simply drowned without ever facing an enemy blade, sinking under the weight of their own armour and gear. Accounts of the battle emphasize that more men died by water than by weapons that day. By early afternoon, the Danish invasion had completely collapsed. King John of Denmark, who had been toward the rear of the army, realized the situation was hopeless and barely managed to escape. Legend has it that the king and a handful of his closest retainers fled on horseback, galloping away from the nightmare at Hemmingstedt before the flood waters and peasants could engulf them. They abandoned everything in their haste. Cannons, wagons, and even the royal banner were left behind. The once proud Danish standard, the Dannebrog, fell into peasant hands, a trophy that symbolized the humiliation of the Danish nobility. As the storm finally began to abate that evening, the scale of the victory for Dithmarschen became clear. On the bloodied causeway and in the flooded fields lay the bodies of thousands of King John's soldiers. By some estimates, around 7,000 invaders died in the Battle of Hemmingstedt, including hundreds of knights and noble lords. Entire companies of the famous Blackguard mercenaries were wiped out. About 800 landsknechts perished, among them their captain Slentz. In contrast, the peasant losses were astonishingly light. Chroniclers claimed that as few as 60 Dithmarscheners were killed. Though that number might be romanticized, it's clear the defenders' casualties were minimal. It was an overwhelming, one-sided triumph. A peasant army had annihilated a king's expedition in a single day. In the aftermath, the Dithmarschen people did not shy away from emphasizing the message of their victory. They took care to bury the fallen enemy soldiers who were of common birth, granting them a measure of respect in death. But they intentionally left the corpses of the aristocrats, the high-born knights and nobles, unburied on the battlefield. The sight of noblemen left to rot in the mud was a deliberate insult, a statement that the feudal lords who sought to enslave free peasants deserved no honor. Dithmarschen folk songs later gloated about how the crows feasted on nightly flesh in the marshes of Hemmingstedt. The peasants also gathered up the spoils of the battlefield. They captured dozens of cannons and wagons and recovered the Danish war chest filled with gold and silver meant to pay the invaders. A welcome prize that would fund their own defense in years to come. The greatest prize was the Dannebrog, the red and white flag of Denmark, which the Dithmarscheners purportedly sent to a church in Verden as a war trophy. This flag, according to legend, was the very banner that had once fallen from the sky in a 13th century Danish crusade. Losing it to peasants was a blow to Danish pride. The Marshes fell silent again, leaving behind only armor, bodies, and a lesson Europe would not forget.